I'm Michael Rathbone. I'm a policy researcher for the Show Me Institute, and today we're going to look at why the Great Depression was so great. Now, not great as in it was a fun time had by all, but great as in large in magnitude. Today we're going to look at three things about the Great Depression. One, what caused it. Two, what caused it to go on for so long. And three, how did we finally get out of it? I'm sure many of you have heard of the stock market crash in 1929, and that's what started the crisis, but it didn't make the Great Depression great. What turned the Great Depression into a depression was a series of bad government policies which turned a sharp recession into a depression. Before talking about the Great Depression, I'd like to talk about the depression that wasn't. Right after World War I, the United States entered a sharp period of economic decline. And the reason for that was that during the war, the United States kept interest rates at a minimum in order to encourage borrowing on the behalf of factories in order to aid the war effort. When the war ended, the United States raised interest rates, and these businesses that relied on low interest rates began to fail. The result? The United States economy shrank by nearly 20%, and the unemployment rate went up to 12%. So what was the government's response to this crisis? Well, under President Harding, the government actually took a hands-off approach, and federal spending fell by nearly half from 1920 to 1922. The result? The unemployment rate actually shrank all the way down to 2.4% by 1923. But there was one member of the government who advocated for a more hands-on approach, and that was then Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover. We'll talk more about him in a minute. The 1920s is often called the Roaring Twenties, and a lot of that is due to the large economic expansion that happened in the country during that period. But part of that growth may have been illusory due to a large growth in the money supply during that same period. And by 1929, the money supply had actually grown by 55%. The Roaring Twenties came to an end in 1929 when the stock market bubble burst. The market tanked, credit collapsed, and now President Hoover decided to intervene. One of the things President Hoover did was urge businesses to keep their wages up. And that sounds like a good idea. If you keep workers' wages up, they'll have more take-home pay and they can spend that extra money in the economy, creating economic growth. However, if you're a businessman and you're forced to keep wages up for your employees and revenue starts to decline, what do you need to do in order to stay in business? Well, if you have less revenue and you have to keep paying your workers the same, you're just going to get rid of your workers. And that's what happened. And President Hoover also increased federal spending by 50% between 1929 and 1932. A lot of that on public works, which we'll see later. Another thing that President Hoover did was that he doubled the income tax in 1931. And finally, President Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was aimed to protect American businesses, but the result was that foreign trade decreased by half. I mentioned previously that President Hoover increased federal spending by 50% and spent a lot of that money on federal works, such as the Hoover Dam. The thinking behind this was that if the government spent money on public works that would employ people, they would have jobs, they would have take-home pay, and then they would spend that money in the greater economy, thus encouraging more economic growth. However, this is an example of what economists refer to as the broken window fallacy. The fallacy in this thinking is that the money that you spent fixing your window is now money you can't spend buying a new pair of shoes or going out to your favorite restaurant. And those businesses that would have received your money now have to do without. The following quote illustrates President Hoover's thinking during the crisis. I determined that it was my duty, even without precedent, to call upon the business of the country for coordinated and constructive action to resist the forces of disintegration. Our leading business concerns have sustained wages, have distributed employment, have expedited heavy construction. The government has expanded public works, assisted in credit to agriculture, and has restricted immigration. Our present experience and relief should form the basis of even more amplified plans in the future. I want you to pay attention to that last sentence. Our present experience and relief should form the basis of even more amplified plans in the future. That's going to be important later. Previously, we went through President Hoover's response to the crisis. So what followed? Well, unemployment rose to 25%. The economy shrank by a quarter, and it set the stage for the election of FDR in 1932. In 1932, President Hoover ran for re-election. The Democrats nominated Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt in New York. Governor Roosevelt campaigned against President Hoover's big government policies. He pledged a reduction in spending and a lowering of tariffs. Governor Roosevelt is elected president, and instead of overturning President Hoover's policies, he expands them. For instance, he signs into law the National Industrial Recovery Act, which sets forth the creation of the National Recovery Administration, which suspends antitrust laws allowing business to set wages and prices. He also enacts the WPA, the Works Projects Administration, which spends even more government money on various public works. For instance, the WPA paid unemployed people to learn how to dance. A contemporary perspective on President Roosevelt's policies came from Rexford Tugwell in 1946, when he reflected that the ideas embodied in the New Deal legislation were a compilation of those which had come to maturity under Herbert Hoover's aegis. Contrary to what many would believe, the New Deal was actually good for big business, as it allowed them to set prices and wages and to put themselves at a competitive advantage relative to smaller businesses. Schechter Poultry Company, which was a small chicken farm in the 1930s, ran afoul of the government when they set their prices lower than the minimum mandated rate. And instead of paying the fine, Schechter Poultry Company appealed to the Supreme Court, which eventually ruled in their favor, striking down the NIRA. The policies of the New Deal were not only harmful to small businesses and consumers, they also were harmful to the nation's minorities. The forced unionization and introduction of minimum wages hurt the economic prospects of African Americans. The literature at the time recognized this fact. A 1934 NAACP publication noted that union labor strategy seems to be to obtain the right to bargain with the employees as the sole representative of labor and then close the union to black workers. Another New Deal policy was the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Its goal was to raise the prices of crops and livestock. In order to do this, the government paid farmers not to farm, and they also destroyed surplus livestock and crops. The government was successful in raising the price of farm goods. Unfortunately, many sharecroppers lost their jobs due to these policies, and many people, already struggling to get by, found food less affordable. During the New Deal, government spending was directed based on political considerations, not economic ones. Government spending was directed to Western states, whose votes were more up for grab, as opposed to Southern states, who were poorer but more politically reliable. Did any of it work? Well, unemployment never dropped below 14.6% until the onset of World War II. In 1939, 2 out of every 3 Americans believed President Roosevelt's policies were having a negative impact on business. 2 UCLA economists estimate that President Roosevelt's policies delayed recovery by a full 7 years, and consumption never returned to pre-Depression levels throughout the entire New Deal. But you don't have to take my word for it. Even members of President Roosevelt's own administration did not feel the New Deal was effective. Here's a quote from President Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau Jr. "No, gentlemen, we have tried spending money. We're spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started." America's entry into World War II had a significant impact on the nation's unemployment rate. In 1942, the unemployment rate dropped to 7%, and by 1944, the nation's unemployment rate was down all the way to 1.3%. Just because the unemployment rate fell doesn't mean the economy as a whole expanded. According to Harvard economist Robert Barrow, for every dollar spent on the war, the rest of the economy shrank by 20 cents, and many products and goods and services became unavailable due to rationing. After the war ended, many economists feared America would slip right back into depression, but this was not the case. In fact, the economy took off. This was partly due to the repeal of several New Deal programs, but also due to the fact that most of the world's industrial base was destroyed during the war. For the Show Me Institute, I'm Michael Rathbone.